Greetings, Bill Bryan here, and I want to share with you a thought. This is concerning racism. It's obviously the big topic these days, as well it should be. My concern is that not enough people understand exactly what racism is. So even though they know it's wrong, many, in an attempt to solve it, are in fact perpetuating it. So I want to talk a little bit about racism. But first, those of you who know me know that I like to study the Bible and philosophy in general, and Eastern, the Tao, and a lot of there's a lot of grist that goes into my mill. But there's a verse in Scripture that has always kind of haunted me because I've never had a clear understanding of what it means or how to apply it. The verse is, "Perfect love casts out all fear." Perfect love casts out all fear. What an interesting concept. Right now, it would seem that fear is being cultivated, and like people are throwing fuel on the fire. We're being taught to be afraid of everything. And not just a coronavirus, but we've been taught to become afraid of people's opinions, people's views. That if somebody is pro this or anti that, that all of a sudden, there's this fear that I don't get to have them as a friend anymore, or that there's going to be tension in the family if not everybody believes the same way about everything. Perfect love casts out all fear. So I have to ask, why are we living in fear? Why are we so afraid of somebody that disagrees with us or that holds a different viewpoint? Why are we so afraid about the outcome of an election? Why are we so afraid about being within 6 feet of somebody because of a virus? And with this racism thing, why are we so afraid of people that are different than us? You know, the Bible has a lot to say about racism. You can read in the book of Esther how Haman sought to genocide, sought to kill all the Hebrews, the Jews of that day. The Egyptians, there was racism there. The Hebrews were held in captivity. You go ahead to the New Testament and you have Jesus speaking with a Samaritan woman, which was a scandalous affair, not only because she was a woman, but she was a Samaritan woman, and the Jews had no dealing with Samaritans. It was an issue of racism. And Jesus just crosses that line, as he often did. He heals the servant of a Roman centurion. That stuff doesn't go over too well in a culture that is being oppressed by the Roman Empire. Racism was a factor all throughout the Old and the New Testament. Even when you get into the Acts of the Apostles, you have the controversy of whether or not Gentiles could become followers of the way, or did they have to become Jewish first? It was another issue of racism. Racism has been a theme throughout the Scripture, and I think that's because it's a theme throughout human history. All too often, those who profess to be fighting against it often are fighting in favor of it, and that is a very cruel irony. To say that a person of African descent is only, what was it, two-thirds human, I think was what the Supreme Court decided. Is just as racist as talking about white privilege, and that if a person is European or Caucasian, that for some reason we are more inherently evil than others. There's enough racism to go around on both sides. I remember as a very young child, and this is a true story, I was about maybe first or second grade, and I met a friend at a playground at a high school in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. And anyway, made friends with this kid, and I was playing in a sandbox, and he came up, and for whatever reason, we started playing together and became friends. And so I walked with him back to his house, and he brought me into his house to introduce me to his mom. And his mom came out, and she looked at me it was not a pleasant look. I remember it to this day. And she looked at her son and said, "What are you doing bringing that white trash home?" This was an African American family. And this little guy, I don't remember his name, and I often wondered whatever became of him. I hope he didn't get caught up in this. But he said, "But Mom, he's my friend." And she said, "Don't bring that white trash in here. You tell him to go on home and wash your hands for supper." And he came back, and I'll never forget, man, he had like tears in his eyes. And my mama says we're not allowed to be friends. And I walked home. And I thought, boy, I just didn't understand that. Racism. It seems to me like if you go back to Genesis, where we read that God creates man in his own image, then we should understand that the diversity of the races is a completion of the image of God. For some reason, each race seems to think that they've cornered the market on being the image of God. That's where you get this supremacy thing and this eugenics, a supreme race. Comes from this idea that there's only one race that's the true image of God, but that's not how things were made, I don't believe. The Asian cultures, the African cultures, the European cultures, all the different cultures that exist on this planet together are a completion of that image. Racism is an acknowledgement of differentiation between races, with this perversion that somehow one race is better than the other. That's racism. Acknowledging the differentiation in races, I think, is healthy and exciting and wonderful. It's the acknowledgement of different colors. It's the acknowledgement of different styles of music. It's diversity. But when we place too much significance on the importance of one and less significance on the importance of the other, that is racism. That's taking the acknowledgement of the differentiation to a level that it was not meant to go to. So for somebody to be insulted for being black, for somebody to be insulted for being white, terms which incidentally I don't like at all. Talk about making a black and white issue out of an... But anyway, for sake of argument, we have blacks, we have whites, we have yellows, we have reds, all these different races. To acknowledge the difference and enjoy the differences, I think, is what was intended. To assume that one was superior to another, no, I That was not intended, I don't believe. And anyone who wants me to feel guilty for being Caucasian is just as racist as somebody who wants to make somebody else feel bad or like less human if they're African, or Asian or whatever. So I think the Bible has a lot to say about this, and unfortunately a lot of people have used the Bible to enforce their racist views, and that is very unfortunate. It's also the result of extremely poor Bible study. I don't think you can study the scriptures and come away a racist, not if you're a serious student. But racism and fear go hand in hand, and that's where I was going with this. The history of racism, particularly in the States, but also in Europe, especially in the United States. Let's talk about that, because that's where I live. As early on as the late 1600s, there was a small aristocratic elite that ran the colonies, and then the bulk of the population in the colonies was slave labor. The slave labor was approximately, well, it wasn't quite half, 50-50, but it was maybe like 2/3 Africans and 1/3 European Caucasians made up the slave population. And one of the constant threats, problems, was slave uprisings. They would uprise against their masters, and I think in like the 1830s or something, there were over 80 some slave uprisings. I can't remember the stats, but the slave owners very quickly realized that the easiest way to put an end to slave uprisings was to get the black slaves and the white slaves to fight amongst themselves. And they did this by passing laws that favored white slaves over black slaves. They gave certain privileges to the white slaves that the black slaves didn't get. So the black slaves became resentful of the white slaves, and the white slaves became fearful that the black slaves were out to get them. And this was there were laws passed deliberately to bring about that result. And it was effective, because now that the slave group was fighting amongst themselves, they didn't rise up against the masters. And that's what it means to live in fear. Perfect love casts out all fear. But the slave class was taught to fear each other, and that kept them divided. I'm sorry, but the same thing is going on today. How many wedges can you drive into a culture and into a society?